G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Today, your dangerous ideas, your dangerous questions, my responses, and a little bit of interactive banter on this TALKBACK episode of Uncomfortable Conversations. One question that we had from a listener who can't join us, unfortunately, who's just had to drop out, was Sasha, who said, we live in such a time of such inflamed discourse. How do you maintain your poise during difficult conversations? This is a relevant question, and one that I get quite a lot, especially this week after the episode with Jaron Lanier. I felt like he sort of got his hackles up and found a way to feel that the whole line of questioning was invalid, without necessarily articulating exactly why it was invalid. It was a tone of dismissiveness, which is a bit different to deal with in an interview than a tone of outright hostility, which also sometimes happens when we're disagreeing about profound issues that strike deeply at a person's core set of beliefs. And the answer to how you deal with it is, I suppose, just to let it be water off a duck's back and recognize that a person is engaging with you using all of the normal, irrational, emotional aspects of humanity that define us all, and to not treat that as being a trigger for me to respond in kind. Like, the object is to get to ideas on this show. The object is to be rational on this show. The object is not to engage in a war of words. I don't want to dunk on people. I'm not about creating clickbait where Josh owns Jaron Lanier and, crushes him or destroys him. But that's not the tone of this show. I really want to understand what people are all about. And in order to do that, you just have to keep that as the sort of defining, guiding light on the hill and not allow oneself to be ruffled. And when it comes to disagreements that are more substantive, less about prickliness and more about a fundamental disagreement about worldviews, then I think it's very useful just to have a kind of emotional empathy and intellectual empathy for where the person is coming from. I always go into conversations, even ones that I feel quite strongly about, with the recognition that I could be wrong. And so I'm really just trying out my ideas and my questions on somebody who might be a lot more right than me. In the case of a Jaron Lanier, he certainly knows more about the subject than I do. So my intuitions may well be leading me astray. So there's no point in me responding to his antagonism with further antagonism, because that's not going to reveal to me what's wrong with my perspective. I want to actually understand what he thinks is wrong with my perspective, and the only way to do that is to make him feel comfortable. That doesn't mean that I throw out my own opinions in a kind of a pathetic attempt to create phony conciliation, but it does mean that I try to put myself in the audience members or the interviewees' shoes and be as generous as I can to the way that they probably see the conversation going and the way that they probably view me, not just because that's the decent thing to do, but because it actually helps me understand my ideas better as well. It reminds me of the old adage that he who doesn't know his opponent's point of view doesn't know his own either. Like, I actually need to understand what people who are disagreeable are thinking in order to understand why I think what I think. I want to share with you something just before we get to our live audience members, and thanks so much for joining us, which is, I devoted about half an hour yesterday to responding to a group WhatsApp thread that I have with a bunch of mates of mine. And one of them is, shall we say, conspiracy theory adjacent, or just more interested than the rest of us are in the things that perhaps slightly wacky people on Joe Rogan say, and will occasionally share with us in glowing terms incredible things that RFK Jr. has said, revealing the truth about vaccines. And the rest of us kind of smirk and nod and move along and put him down a little bit. And he recently shared the appearance that Terrence Howard had on Joe Rogan's show. Now, I haven't seen this, but apparently this is a jumble of crazed ideas where Terrence Howard, an actor who I didn't even know until he was on Joe Rogan, is talking about how actually he's revolutionized mathematics, and 1 times 1 does not equal 1. It couldn't possibly. 1 times 1 has to equal 2, and gravity is misunderstood, and a whole bunch of things where he feels like he's literally taking down the establishment consensus about a whole bunch of profound issues that he has no expertise in. And I felt like our response to this individual in our group chat was somewhat uncharitable and somewhat unkind. And it put me in a position of going, okay, well, if I'm all about having uncomfortable conversations with people, and I see a scenario in which someone is, I believe, misled by something online, something that probably shouldn't be online, because Joe probably shouldn't have that person on unless he's also got a mathematician and a physicist to push back on them. How do I respond? How do we, as a community, as friends, as family members, respond when we see people perhaps slightly going off the rails in our estimation? And I want to read you what I wrote, because I don't want to waste a half hour of my work time in replying only to my friends in the WhatsApp. Let's call this individual David, shall we? So as to protect the names of the innocent. I said, let me try to bring my powers of conciliation to this conversational mess. David's curiosity is admirable, and his skepticism towards mainstream explanations has an honourable history. Powerful institutions have repeatedly had blind spots and biases that have lasted far too long, and their attacks on dissenting voices have been smug and blinkered. Progress requires an open-mindedness that can appear to defenders of a mainstream narrative like credulity or wackiness. We saw far too much dismissiveness from mainstream institutions towards people who argued, for example, that the US government invented the Gulf of Tonkin incident to justify the Vietnam War, or that Saddam Hussein did not have WMDs, or, during COVID, that governments and the media were exaggerating the effectiveness of lockdowns and vaccines at eliminating transmission. I went on to write, but we also live at a moment when billions of amateurs now have access to amplification algorithms that are flooding the zone with shit. Those conspiracists enjoy an unprecedented platform thanks to the interplay of social media, podcasts, disinformation, media bias, and the splintering of audiences. Our job as responsible citizens, as good thinkers, good parents, and good friends, is to be neither sanctimonious about what we think we know, nor gullible about what we don't. I went on to say, in general, big lies tend to get debunked by dissidents who know a lot about the field in question. They understand the mainstream dogma. They see its blind spots. They've punched holes in it a million ways. They've endured criticism from their peers, and they've diligently built up a well-informed alternative hypothesis. Then a tipping point comes at which the Davids of the world say, you know what, the guy isn't actually crazy, and we all pile on David and say he's a fool because from David's perspective, we're brainwashed sheeple. And David's right in the sense that none of us is a mathematician nor a physicist. The problem here is, nor is Terence Howard. On the spectrum between, on the one hand, well-informed dissidents who are being unfairly maligned by elites, and on the other hand, whack jobs flooding the zone with shit, Terence leans towards the latter. So the listener's honourable instinct to be sceptical of mainstream narratives gets perverted and derailed by an information ecosystem that elevates dum-dums as much as it does dissenting experts. And we're not really in a position to tell the difference, except via our instinct about whom to trust. One response, I write, to this cacophony is to reflexively side with the mainstream narrative, which in general will be more correct more often than not. But in so doing, we can come across as smug and unthinking to people who crave alternative explanations, which drives them further down the rabbit hole. I don't know what to do about this clash of perspectives, other than to devote my professional life to producing content that seeks to remedy it. But what I do know is that Joe Rogan's audience needs to show greater skepticism towards self-proclaimed skeptics, and the rest of us need to show greater compassion for people who instinctively side with them. Peace out. I hope that's useful. I think it's useful. I think it's a decent articulation of the way that I think that we need to respond to the moment that we find ourselves in. In that spirit, let's go to some calls and some webcams. Susan, do we have Susan on the line? G'day, Susan.
Good morning.
Good morning. Where are you?
Sydney.
Fabulous. Isn't it nice this time of year?
It's gorgeous. I played tennis this morning, and apart from having the sun actually in my eyes, it was really a beautiful way to start the day.
How fabulous. How early did you start playing tennis?
7. Every Thursday.
Aren't you good? Aren't you good? It gets a little bit harder getting out of bed, doesn't it? when it's cold.
There is that.
Yeah. What do you want to talk about?
Well, leadership training, actually. I feel
Okay.
like we've got an obsession with leadership training and that everyone is expected to train as a leader. And I'm not sure why. I'm just not sure why we need everybody to want to be a leader.
Do you mean like in schools or in organizations?
Both. And I'm
Right.
going to preface this by outing myself as someone who is not a leader. I don't want to be a leader. I'm a good 2IC. I like to get the job done. I don't like to make strategic decisions and take risks and do all those difficult things. I like to do analysis and test someone else's ideas with them, but I don't want to lead. But every job I've ever had has required me to do leadership training. I don't really want to get into the qualities and behaviours of a leader. I think that's really well covered by management theory. We don't need to debate it here, other than maybe I'd like to suggest that you're only a leader if you've got people that want to follow you.
Yeah, right.
But leadership training, is it really necessary for one's life work to be striving to lead? And it does start in primary school, where kids are given these leadership opportunities, continues on into high school. And every employer of graduates is looking for leadership potential amongst their graduate cohort or their graduate recruits. But they can't surely expect them all to rise up to be leaders. But try going to a job interview and saying, oh, no, actually, I don't think I'm a leader. I'm a doer. You won't get very far.
That's interesting, isn't it? Do you have people who are answerable to you at work?
I did have, and, I don't mind supervising them and all, but I don't want to feel responsible for giving them career advice because, what would I know about that? I once went to a seminar where Amanda Vanstone, a former Liberal senator, was the keynote speaker, and she was always a bit of a straight shooter. And at the time, she had left politics, and she was no longer representing the government in politics or as an ambassador. And at that time, the Liberal leadership was going through turmoil and they were all rolling each other.
When is it not?
Well, that is true. But John Howard had lost his seat just recently and his leadership and his prime ministership. And the parliamentary party had been led by Brendan Nelson, if you remember those days.
Yep, 2008.
Followed by Malcolm Turnbull, followed by Tony Abbott. And Amanda Riley commented that surely not everyone can aspire to be a leader. And in fact, in politics, it's better if there's only one.
You mentioned briefly, Susan, the qualities of a leader. I mean, when you talk about politics, like it has often been remarked that anyone who actually wants to be the leader of a country is probably not qualified to do so. And in fact, like the founding fathers of the United States were all about like, no one should be nominating themselves to be president. The president should sort of be chosen by a cohort of peers and grudgingly nominated, and the person should only want to do it for a short while and then go back to their civilian life. And now we've got a situation where there's a professional class of professional would-be leader wannabes who are all scrambling for the top, and maybe they don't have the right characteristics of what you would want in a leader anyway, which is some level of humility, reality checking, and self-effaceiveness.
And people that want to follow them.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, and do you think that maybe part of the focus on leadership is because the job market today is so unstable that you're going to have to be a self-starter and a go-getter in order to get through? Because I don't know, the era that my grandfather lived in, where when he was 15, he left school, walked into a shoe factory in New Zealand, and walked out of the same shoe factory at the age of 55 with a retirement pension. Like, that's not around anymore, is it? So wouldn't he have, in today's world, wouldn't he be well armed if he did have leadership skills?
Maybe that's why we have to do, maybe it's like cooking or learning to change tire. You just never know when you're going to be called upon. And so everybody needs to be trained to step up when the moment comes. But I don't know. I feel like there's people that have natural qualities as leaders and maybe they don't need to be trained. I'm thinking historical leaders and Moses and Jesus Christ and people like that. And then there's people like Vladimir Zelensky who managed to inspire a nation to follow him into war and in response to a war. And he was a comedian, I think. I don't think he had leadership training.
No, that's right. Yeah. So maybe, do you think that true leadership is something that can't be taught?
I don't know.
I'd like to set up the Moses Leadership Training Academy with you, Susan. I think we'd do a roaring trade. Yeah, you're reminding me a little bit also of like the fact that there are some companies that intentionally position themselves in the market as being non-leaders, like that there's value. I mean, even like, you know, there are giant tech companies that are not usually first movers. They wait until they see someone else try to develop something harebrained and make all the mistakes. They learn from the mistakes, and then they come along and slip into the slipstream and nail it. I wonder if we need, instead of leadership training courses, like, you know, how to be the best runner-up.
Or how to just get the job done, how to be a good, solid worker that produces output. We need those.
How do you measure the output though, Susan? I think maybe part of it is like the confusion in our contemporary society where it's very hard to measure value because the best value comes from ideas and from deep work. So we've reached a point at which there's a lot of busy work where people, you know, scurry around and get in early and stay late and look like they're doing things, but they're not actually contributing much in reality because they're just sort of making themselves look busy. And I wonder if leadership training programs are a proxy for trying to deal with worker bees. Because I got to say, I'm not very inspired when I hear you say like maybe all you want is someone who just gets the job done. That to me feels like I'm going to get some hyper unionized person like you meet when you go to Centrelink or the DMV, and they're going to technically do all of the things that they were required to do, but they're not going to put in an ounce more effort than they actually have to. And that's not a characteristic you want in an employee either.
No, but I also don't think you want them all competing with each other to try and rise above and be some sort of leader either. You want them focused on the job, not on their own personal ambition.
Yep.
And I do wonder if all this leadership training in school is what leads us to people who find they can't lead any other way, so they all become influencers.
Right.
That's how they can get their followers.
Right.
I don't know.
Yes, and the follower-leader dynamic, is obviously exacerbated by an online landscape where followers are the ultimate thing that you can have, and the follower count. Oh, it's so depressing. Now that you put it that way, it's kind of depressing, isn't it? Like the idea that some influencer with like fat injected duck lips and Botox and a boob job lying on a beach is a leader because she's got 10 million Instagram followers is mildly depressing. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Susan.
Yes.
No. Do you want to finish that thought?
Oh, no, that's all right. I've talked enough about that.
Thanks, Susan. All right, go follow, don't lead. I like that. Who do we have next? Is John, I believe, on the line, or Roger or John?
This is John.
Okay, great. Where are you, John?
I am an American.
Beautiful. John's literally, for people who aren't watching on YouTube, he's literally doing I'm holding my phone up while I'm walking in a park, and it's a jerky but idyllic looking place. You're in Georgia.
Yes, I am walking on a canal in Augusta, Georgia.
Fabulous. I
am an American, but I am a graduate. I am a graduate of the Uni of Queensland, so I have spent some time in Australia.
Fabulous.
So I like to think of myself as having the reverse Zepp's perspective as an American who's spent some time in Australia and has a lot of opinions on Australia. And I think that was the substance of the question that I wanted to get at.
Wait, before you get to the question, what are your top three? What are the top three opinions about Australia that you developed?
Oh, top three opinions about Australia. I mean, it was just so empty. I couldn't believe that there were so few people there. From an American perspective, it boggles the mind. We have several states that have more people than the entire country.
Yes, we have the population of Florida basically in the same size as the contiguous United States.
Yeah. I felt like the wildlife kind of owned the place. I felt like, the Australians would allow animals to come into public spaces and do things where Americans would never permit it.
Like what?
And I felt like there was a great... Well, I mean, I think you actually had an episode where there was a kookaburra where it was eyeing your food.
Oh, yeah. That's right. While I was recording.
I've never had a bird actually try to take my food in the U.S., but in Byron Bay I have.
It's just when you said that we allow wild animals to do things that Americans never would, I have images of like a couple of kangaroos masturbating each other on the Harbour Bridge, which doesn't happen frequently.
Well, I used to live in a an apartment that had windows with no window screens on them, which is unthinkable for us. And I had a huntsman spider crawl in, and I was just thinking,
Oh, I
that would
see.
never happen in the U.S.
Yeah, that's right.
That was
Yes,
terrifying.
yes. My American husband is also always remarking on this, that we'll leave our door because the climate is so pleasant for 9 months of the year. You just leave your doors open without fly screens because it's too much hassle to keep opening them and closing them. And we don't have tons of midges and mosquitoes the way that like the American Midwest does. So we just tolerate it. And occasionally there's a spider inside, and my husband is always like, keep it outside, and teasing Australians for being like, oh, it's the spider's home just as much as it is our home. We're the interlopers. Let the spider be. So yes, carry on.
Oh, I think there's a great deal of tolerance of the wildlife and a great deal of reverence for the natural environment. I see so much of the Australian coast has been not overdeveloped in the way that a lot of the American coast has. So that's what I really appreciate Australia.
Did you know that in Australia you
I should
have
say.
to, the coastline, like the shoreline is all mandatory public land. So by law, it's not like in Europe. I'm not sure what the situation is in the States, where there are whole chunks of the coast where a private resort will be able to put up a bunch of deck chairs, or a person's house will block access from one part of the coastline to the other part because some rich shitpoke has a beach at their property. The entirety of the island coastline of many thousands of miles is all public.
And I made good use out of it while I was there.
Excellent. All right, what do you want to talk about?
So my question was about, there's been a lot of remarks from you lately about the difference in values between Australians and Americans, with Australians being more collectivist and not having the same commitment to individualism that, of course, Americans distinctively have. And, that plays out with regards to public health and COVID. It plays out with regards to the free speech issues, with the provision of social services and healthcare, all of those things. But in my experience in Australia, I was just amazed at how much I saw of Chinese people, Chinese culture, Chinese money in Australia. And I'm wondering if you think that in addition to the intrinsic cultural difference between America and Australia, Australia is becoming a little bit more like China.
That's fascinating. Well, I don't think it's becoming more like China because of a Chinese psyop, or because like Chinese, spies are infiltrating our media or something like that, if there's any of that insinuation in the question. But it is interesting. I mean, it was really revealed most starkly during COVID, John, where, you had... There's something that sociologists talk about, which is horizontal trust and vertical trust. So some societies are more trusting horizontally and some are more trusting vertically, and they have different levels of each kind of trust. And you can think of horizontal trust as being trust in your fellow citizen, trust in the common man, but that might be paired with low vertical trust, meaning low trust in elite institutions and in authorities. So, I don't know, countries like Greece, for example, might have strong horizontal trust, but low vertical trust, in the sense that you might leave your door open on an island in Greece or in a town and you wouldn't worry about someone robbing you, and you would trust someone to do the right thing, but there's no way in hell that you would trust the government as far as you could throw them. And then there are countries with strong vertical trust and low horizontal trust. Often this is in East Asia, for example. I mean, China would be the archetype, but even in democracies like Japan, there'll be a strong sense of trust in authorities and in doing the right thing as it is defined by the people above you in hierarchies. And you can have religious communities which are like this as well. And most of the Anglo-democratic world does not have very strong vertical trust. And America would be the exemplar of that. Like, Americans do not trust authority and have an instinctive suspicion of anything the government tries to tell them to do. And what happened during COVID was, interestingly, Australia and New Zealand seemed to exhibit the same kind of vertical trust that you would expect from East Asia, and a lot of horizontal trust as well. There was a lot of just trust in your fellow citizen not to break the lockdown rules, for example. So it didn't actually need to be policed very strongly, because Aussies love a rule and we love obeying things. But the fact that we were so unruffled by public health officials and politicians telling us to derange our lives for quite a long period of time was more... I mean, it more closely resembled an attitude that you might find in Korea or Japan or China or Japan than what you would find in the UK or the US. And I'm not quite sure what mechanism that happens by, because you're right. There is definitely a different attitude towards collectivism. We have universal healthcare. Mind you, everyone has that pretty much apart from the US. We have a sort of egalitarian ethos, the idea of giving everyone a fair go and a fair shake. And we're less hung up about ensuring that our individual freedoms aren't trampled on by the boot of the big man. Whether that is because of high rates of Chinese immigration and Chinese investment in Australia, I'm more skeptical of. I don't know. I'd love to talk to a sociologist or an anthropologist about what the mechanism is by which societies might evolve that way. Like if Australia and New Zealand were located geographically not in the South Pacific / East Asia, but were located, I don't know, where the Azores are or something, like in the middle of the Atlantic, would you have the same characteristics of kind of national collectivism, or would we be more independent and hardy? It's a good question. I mean, it has to, I guess, being very multicultural societies, you need a certain amount of horizontal trust in order to incorporate large numbers of people from different communities and different ethnicities and trust them and not end up in a civil war. But where does the vertical trust come from? Where does the compliance come from? I mean, as much as anything, John, it may be just a consequence of having good governance. Like maybe to the extent that that you're run by shitty governments, it corrodes your trust. I mean, the reason why Greeks don't have trust in their government might be because their governments are all incompetent. And it may be the same in the United States. Partly. Like, Al Franken, the former Saturday Night Live writer and alum and former senator, has a saying that I like, which is that Republicans run on the platform that government doesn't work, and then they get elected and prove it. There's actually an incentive in some ways for people whose whole shtick is that government is bad to get into government and then gum up the system and make it not work, and then they can turn around and say, see, I told you so. And for some reason that doesn't quite exist here. I must say the biggest changes in my moving from the States, where I lived for about a dozen years in New York City, to moving back to Australia a few years ago, was noticing how much less stressful it is to deal with the tax office and how easy it is to get a driver's license and how easy it is to lodge things on a government app on my phone. Whereas in the States, the IRS login code would be something like, I recently applied for a new Internal Revenue Service US tax login. And I get to the final page after this 25-minute arduous thing of having to look up a code that was on my last tax return that I lodged, and who knows where that tax return is. Why do they need that? Why don't they just need my social security number? But I find it, I get it, and then the final page says, your new login will be mailed to you in 4 to 6 weeks. I'm like, I need to do this stuff now. That doesn't happen so much in Australia. And the other thing that I noticed was the sort of nanny statism of Australia, the fact that everyone drives at the speed limit, the place is awash with speed cameras that catch people. There is a very reliable and systematic presence of the state in governing what you can do, where you can drink, how much you can drink. And those things I think are remarkable to note on when you move back here. But I think it's a bit of a long bow to connect it to China. Can you think of a mechanism by which China would be responsible?
Well, yeah. So to be clear, I'm not going for the strongest sort of conspiratorial version of it in most cases, but Americans, I think, sort of presume that our soft power projects over the world and that that's the only one. I don't think that CIA operatives planted pictures of Michael Jordan in huts in Africa, but they got there somehow, right? American culture gone everywhere. So I think it's possible that if you have enough Chinese tourists and Chinese students, that the country will sort of passively China-fy without any plot behind it.
Right.
But the other thing I will say is that I was last in Australia in 2019, and it was right when the transition in Hong Kong was happening. And we had a couple of visitors from a medical school in China, and one of the Australian medical school faculty came to us before they got there and said, don't ask them about Hong Kong. And I I was just flabbergasted. I couldn't believe like that was any of his business to say that. And so in that case, I think there probably is a direct financial interest in the amount of money that the Chinese government puts into Australian education, which was clearly quite large.
Yeah, then I mean that if you're talking about the education sector, if you're talking about universities and colleges and tertiary education, there's a massive conflict of interest between the amount of money that they get from Chinese students and Chinese sponsors and the extent to which they can question the Communist Party's behavior, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tiananmen Square. I think I can't see, because so much of our culture still is it comes from the United States and the UK. I don't. There is no Chinese show on Australian television that is being translated into English. There's no overt mechanism by which it would be disseminated. But I take your point that, yeah, I'll keep an eye out for it. There's probably more. There's probably more influence of an East Asian collectivist perspective bleeding through Chinese money into the education system than there is into the broader culture at large. But I suppose it's only a matter of time before one becomes the other as university students grow up. John, enjoy Georgia. When you first said Georgia, I wasn't sure if you meant the nation of Georgia or the state of Georgia, but I'm glad you're in the state of Georgia. It's probably sunnier.
Yes, it's actually, it's nighttime here since I'm on the far side of the world, and it's going to be a very pretty sunset in just a minute.
Lovely. Beautiful. Great to talk to you, John. Thanks for chiming in. Let's have a chat too. Do we have Roger on the line?
Hi, Josh. How you doing?
Hello, mate. Good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
I just want to first of all say I wish I could trust my tech stack as much as John did walking in a park while taking this call.
I know. It's bold. It's exactly. That's right. That's his US rugged individualism, just strolling through a Georgia park. I mean, yeah, there's a whole conversation to be had about the quality of Australian technology and the failure of Australia to keep up with high internet speeds. And I say this as someone who has an NBN technician at my house right now fixing the national broadband network. But that's a conversation for another day.
Maybe get Turnbull on.
Yeah, I know. I've had Turnbull on. Yes, I should get him back. Go for it, Roger. What's on your mind?
I want to preface this by saying that I have been on both sides of the religion debate. Grew up in the church and then went through a very conscious process of becoming a different kind of spiritual and agnostic to organized religion. But the question I want to ask today is, are Christians under attack? Now, there's been a few lines of this in the news, with Trump saying that Christianity is being cancelled and using, I suppose, a Christian nationalism platform. And I'm no fanboy of Scott Morrison, but he does receive some disrespect that's, I feel, a little bit off towards his religious beliefs. And a great example of that is a recent interview and podcast on The Briefing with Antoinette Lattouf, I believe, where she asked him whether he wanted to seek forgiveness or repent for his policy decisions while in office. So I'm just looking to get your opinion on what this says about the state of affairs, and in a world that has so much empathy for other causes and other areas, is Christianity the whipping post?
I mean, aren't those two questions though? Because someone being snide in an interview, I'm not sure that it's illegitimate to ask a deeply religious person who wears their religion on their sleeve if when they acknowledge that they've done something wrong, whether or not that means that they should repent for it. But I didn't hear that. So, but anyway, setting aside whether or not that's a legitimate question to ask in an interview, because I mean, like if he was a closet Pentecostal, that would be one thing. But I mean, he's public about his Christianity and he frequently talks about how important it is in his life. So if he was talking about something where he thought he made a mistake, I don't think it's illegitimate to say, is that something that, would be such a mistake that that would be a spiritual mistake or a religious mistake as well? And how does that mesh with your faith and your doctrine? But on the broader question of like who's winning or losing the culture war, I'm just enormously cautious about revivifying the Christian identity by allowing it to have a persecution complex because it's rubbish. To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing, if it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.